What does it take to win a Nobel Prize? Make an invention or discovery that no one has made before? Not quite. I have been asked by many of my subscribers to make some videos on scientific discoveries, and hence I am starting a series called Pioneers of Science, where I intend to uncover the truths and hard work behind some of the greatest discoveries made by humans. Swat cats, this one is for you. I will start with the story of a man who almost put his life in danger to save the lives of numerous others in the future. This is the man who persevered against all odds when the entire scientific and medical community were against the findings with such a dogged determination that he was willing to put his life on line to prove his point. Welcome to the first episode of Pioneers of Science from Pale Blue Thoughts, the channel which promotes science and debunks pseudoscience. The name is Barry J. Marshall. He is an Australian physician who worked a lot in the treatment of peptic ulcers. A peptic ulcer is a break in the inner lining of the stomach, small intestine or esophagus. When it occurs in the stomach, it is called as a gastric ulcer. People suffering from gastric ulcers develop a burning ache in their stomach and can show belching, vomiting, weight loss, the loss of appetite, and in some cases bleeding. In some cases, gastric ulcers lead to the development of stomach cancers. Although there are various reasons for this disease as we know today, for decades people thought that it was stress, spicy foods and too much stomach acid that caused it. Out of this, stress was always considered the major factor, and treatment was mostly psychological to relieve the stress or to remove the stomachs when infected badly. In fact, the scientific community had come to a consensus on the pathogenesis of ulcers. All except one man, Barry J. Marshall. He met a pathologist named Robin Warren who was interested in gastritis while doing his fellowship training in internal medicine in 1981. Warren had been treating several patients with gastritis and ulcers, and he noticed a curious thing. All the patients had a culture of a spiral-shaped bacteria in their stomachs. These bacteria, called Helicobacter pylori, was already known to the medical world since 1893, and some doctors like Dr. Stone Freeberg had suggested links between these bacteria and ulcers. Helicobacter pylori infection usually has no symptoms but sometimes causes gastritis or stomach inflammation or ulcers of the stomach or first part of the small intestine. The infection is also associated with the development of certain cancers. In fact, H. pylori enters into a human being as early as their childhood. In 2015, it was estimated that over 50% of the world's population had H. pylori in their upper gastrointestinal tracts. Up to 90% of the people infected with Helicobacter pylori never experience symptoms or complications. However, individuals infected with H. pylori have a 10% to 20% lifetime risk of developing peptic ulcers. But one of the reasons why an established link between H. pylori and ulcers couldn't be found was because people abandoned their research due to widespread opposition from the wider scientific community. For them, the concept of a germ causing ulcers was like saying that the earth is flat. Their conclusion was unanimous. It was stress that caused ulcers. They did not believe that any bacteria could live in the acidic environment of the stomach. But Barry Marshall was not going to buckle down. Marshall, along with Warren, studied the presence of the spiral bacteria in association with gastritis. In 1982, they performed the initial culture of H. pylori and developed their hypothesis on the bacterial cause of peptic ulcers and gastric cancer. The first 30-odd samples showed no support for their hypothesis, but on the 34th test, they were able to culture Helicobacter pylori. In 1983, they submitted their findings thus far to the Gastroenterological Society of Australia, but the reviewers turned their paper down, rating it in the bottom 10% of those they received that year. Meanwhile, he was successfully treating patients who were facing life-threatening ulcers using antibiotics and bismuth. Marshall became sure that it was these bacteria that were causing the ulcers. He knew that he was right and that his discovery could revolutionize the treatment of ulcer disease. It would be simple, cheap, and more importantly, effective. He knew that his research had to be fast-tracked for the sake of his patients. He wanted to get his hypothesis proved as a theory quickly to provide relief to millions of patients suffering from ulcers around the world. One of the main reasons for rejection was lack of animal studies. Even though Marshall and Warren managed to culture H. pylori, they couldn't use it to infect lab animals such as rats and pigs. The next option was to test it on humans, but that was not possible due to the regulations. Left with no other options, Barry Marshall decided to test it on the only human ready to appear for the experiment, himself. So on 12th June 1984, Marshall made his final desperate attempt. First, he got a baseline endoscopy done as an evidence that he did not have ulcers. Then he took a culture from the stomach of a patient with ulcer and got the bacteria. He then worked out which antibiotics would kill the infection in his lab, bismuth and metronidazole. After that, he swirled the organisms around in a cloudy broth and drank it the next morning. Yes, Marshall actually drank a broth containing cultured Helicobacter pylori, expecting to develop, perhaps years later on, an ulcer. He was surprised when only 3 days later he developed vague nausea and bad breath. There was no acid to kill bacteria in the stomach, and their waste products manifested as bad breath, noticed only by his mother. On days 5 to 8, he developed no acid vomiting. On day 8, he had a repeat endoscopy which showed massive inflammation or gastritis and a biopsy from which Helicobacter pylori was cultured, showing it had colonized his stomach. Now, even his wife wasn't aware of the risk that Marshall was putting himself to. However, on the 14th day, his wife discovered what Marshall was up to. Now, even a scientist knows that upsetting one's wife is nothing compared to getting stomach ulcers or cancer. So, paying heed to her advice, he got a third endoscopy done and started taking antibiotics. Very soon, he was cured of the ulcers as shown in a further endoscopy. This experiment was published in 1985 in the Medical Journal of Australia and is among the most cited articles from the journal. But did that convince the rest of the doctors? No, it just sat there as a hypothesis for another 10 years. Some patients heard about it, but gastroenterologists still would not treat them with antibiotics. By 1985, Marshall could cure just about everybody, and patients were coming to him in secret. Finally, in 1994, in the face of overwhelming evidence, the US National Institute of Health conducted a 2-day summit that concluded that the key to the detection of duodenal and gastric ulcer was the detection and eradication of Helicobacter pylori. And thus, finally, the medical community started to take notice. They changed their stance and accepted Marshall's hypothesis as a working theory with evidence. And 11 years later, he was awarded the Nobel Prize along with Robert Warren for his work on finding the causal link between a spiral-shaped bacteria and peptic ulcers. Now, many may say that this is just an anecdotal evidence. However, the method in which Marshall conducted his experiment makes it distinct. Marshall confirmed the evidence by taking endoscopy before, during, and at the end of his experiment. Now compare this with the anecdotal evidences that homeopaths, Ayurvedics, and other alternate medicine practitioners provide. They just give a medicine, and if the disease is cured, they claim that it was due to their medicine. There is no evidence to prove that it was actually the medicine that cured the disease. That is where Barry Marshall's desperate attempt stands out. He proved inconclusively that it was Helicobacter pylori which caused the disease, and he cured it with the medicine he took. And he hasn't stopped at this. He continues to work with Helicobacter pylori as if it's an old friend. Now he is taking things to a new level. He is working on using the bacteria as a delivery system to make vaccines against influenza. He is into experimenting with strains of Helicobacter that doesn't cause any symptoms. Then he will take the influenza surface protein and clone that into the Helicobacter. You just take one sip, and 3 days later, the whole surface of your stomach is covered with the modified Helicobacter. Over a few weeks, your immune system starts reacting against it and also sees the influenza proteins stuck on the surface. So it starts creating antibodies against influenza as well. Now, a parting thought for my viewers. Sure, one must always question new ideas and thoroughly vet them, but when a mountain of well-documented evidence is found in easily repeatable, scientifically performed experiments that an old theory was wrong and a new one is right, one shouldn't continue to oppose it just because it goes against what you believed before. So that is one of the secrets of winning the Nobel Prize. In fact, the title is taken from a book that Barry Marshall himself has penned for kids. In this, he talks about the fascinating stories behind many different Nobel Prize winners. If you found this episode interesting, please share this through your social media so that this information reaches many others. And let me know your comments as usual below. I shall be back with more pioneers in the upcoming videos. Until then, it's bye bye from Pale Blue Thoughts.